If you want to support disabled people in this moment, then I want you to post wherever you post with the hashtag #CountDisabledPeoplesVotes. Why? Because the majority of the people that voted by mail are medically vulnerable, whether they're disabled or chronically ill. So they posted their votes in the mail because it was safer. By not counting them, they are not counting the disability community. We need to be livid about it.
Absolutely. That was disabled rights activist Imani Barbarin dropping some knowledge there as we are just now a week away from Election Day. Feels like it's been at least a couple of years, but no, Election Day was 1 week ago. And we know because of the pandemic and the rampant barriers right now to voting for most people, especially disabled people in communities of color, that was her plug and plea to make sure that voting was accessible to everybody. And listen, gang, hello. First of all, my name is Kim Brown. Nice to meet you. Welcome to Burn It Down with Kim Brown. We appreciate to see all your smiling faces. Thank y'all so much for being here. Today's show is Dehumanizing the Disabled Won't End with a Democrat in Office. And this is a very, very important topic, y'all. Disabled people make up roughly 60 million people in this country, a tremendous amount of folks. We're talking about disabled adults and children, and disability rights is an afterthought, if it's even thought about at all. Today's topic, we're going to discuss how COVID, how the pandemic helped to bring to the forefront all the fucked up shit that happens to disabled people in this country, from rampant and casual ableism, inaccessibility in our society, to the bigger issues of like rationing care during a pandemic, medical professionals telling disabled people that, hey, your quality of life may not count as much as this quote unquote healthy person. So we're going to prioritize saving the healthy person over the disabled person. And who gets to make these decisions? Why are these decisions made? In addition to analyzing and breaking down what the Biden-Harris plan is for COVID and by at large the disabled community. So we have a wonderful conversation standing by for you. Of course, we want to hear from you in the chat and in the comments. Please drop them comments in the chat. We certainly appreciate that. I'd like to welcome our fantastic guest today. And these are two faces that you have probably seen, especially if you have been watching us here on Stir Crazy on The Real News. Jen Derenwater from First Nation Fridays fame, even though she's way famous, more famous than First Nation Fridays. She's the executive director of Crushing Colonialism. Jen is a freelance journalist. She's an Indigenous activist and a disabled rights activist as well. So we're so glad to see Jen's beautiful face on our program today. We're also joined with Justine Barron, another one of my favorite people. Justine is an independent journalist. She's covered a lot of crime stories in Baltimore City, but Justine has been recovering from COVID for these past several months, and she's what they call a COVID long hauler. She's been dealing with ongoing chronic symptoms as related to her COVID diagnosis. And this is the case with a lot of folks, y'all. We're dealing with about 10 million infections here in this country, with a ghastly number of people who have died. But I believe that number is like at 235,000, in and around there somewhere. But for all the people that recover from COVID, there are a number. When I say recover, let me rephrase that. People who survive COVID, the number of people who are still recovering from this disease and still dealing with chronic issues with their heart, lungs, kidneys. I'm hearing about COVID onset lupus, COVID onset glaucoma, and lo and behold, we may even have a vaccine. So there's a lot going on. So Jen and Justine, first of all, thank you both so much for joining me today, especially to talk about this. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you again. It's always a good day when I get to spend it with you, Kim.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad. Justine, don't you want to say hi to me?
I do. Something happened with my screen where I can't see you, but you guys could see me, right?
Let me pull your face back up. I was looking at my document.
Right.
I can see you. Yes, I can totally see you. Yes, there you go.
Okay, yeah. I'm not seeing y'all, but I'm here and I am recovering from COVID. And I also just wanted to add that I'm also a disabled person. So I have a pre-existing disability. So I'm a
So
double
let me-
winner.
and listen, and there's a lot of folks out there who are, this year has taken a lot away from a lot of people, and people who have pre-existing conditions have been like walking on pins and needles literally like all year, trying to duck COVID as best as they can, trying to make sure that they minimize their potential exposure, which has meant a lot of social isolation, self-isolation, which is another part of the discussion we could get into about how mental health plays a part in this discussion. But I wanted to begin, if I could, with the Biden-Harris plan for attacking COVID. And we know that, Trump fucked this up big time, right? So Joe Biden is now the president-elect. He and Kamala Harris have released their plan for dealing with COVID. Can we pop that up if we could here, Dwayne? Because, oh yes, there we go. It looks pretty interesting. I mean, by interesting, I mean probably not going far enough, but the very least bottom line thing we can expect from a Biden-Harris administration is there at the top. The first bulleted point is listen to science. And I know that sounds like a huge deal given the dumb assery that we have just been exposed to for these past 4 years with Donald Trump and his minions. So listen to science. That's a good sign, a good first step. It also goes on to say, ensure public health decisions are informed by public health professionals, okay, common sense, promotes trust, transparency, common purpose, and accountability in our government, blah, 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 blah. The big news, I guess, coming out of the Biden-Harris plan has to do with the mask mandate, something that Joe Biden has throughout the campaign said that he stands in support of, and that he's going to work with the governors to help implement a mask mandate as we move ahead into the winter months. But, I want to start with, Justine, actually, I'm going to start with you because you are recovering from COVID. If you don't mind, could you share with us your experience with contracting the virus and what that was like to what your recovery process has been and is still ongoing?
Yeah, I was very locked down. I hadn't left the house in 7 weeks. I lived by myself. And I went to a doctor to try a new medication, which is an injection. It would have been my second injection. It's one of these migraine injections. And that was it. That was my only contact. And I started to get really sick afterwards. And so the doctors told me, well, there's no COVID in our office. I went to the waiting room and a woman injected me, that nobody else was there. And so I must have just been reacting to the medication. And so I just sort of took that for granted. And she was very insistent. And yet I kept reporting to her for weeks, like, this is really bad. I didn't have this last time. I was lucky it didn't go to my lungs at first. I was dealing with fevers of really high, for me especially, because my temperature is usually low, and fatigue like I've never experienced. I thought I knew fatigue from my pre-existing condition. I mean, this was like if a fire was happening in the building, I might not have been able to get out and go, and chills and just general sickness. And because I sort of believed my doctor that I must have been reacting to the medication, I didn't get tested or treated quickly enough. And then I had to move. And if I'd had a positive, by the time I tested, I was negative. And later I had positive antibodies. So I know, and I also, by the way, found out that the woman that gave me the shot was infected. And she told me anecdotally, my doctor's office never called me, which should be a health violation. And so it was all very chaotic. And the place I was living was just like, sorry, you have to move. And I know there were laws to protect me, but, it's a long story, but there really wasn't any laws to protect me. So I was out on the streets at like a month after contracting COVID, trying to find housing, which is hard because I need accessible housing. And it is important to treat what you have quickly because, I didn't take some of even just the basic medications that I could have taken. And I think it's important to be your own doctor in this and recognize that you're experiencing something weird. And then the long haul part of it was that after a couple of months, I seemed to recover. I did a little activity and it seemed gone. And so I started to exercise, which for me are these long walks on the beach, so on the sand, and it's a lot of exertion. And then I relapsed, and that's how the long haul COVID works, is that you have these relapses. And I just have been treating it mostly through Chinese medicine, a lot of reading, and my pre-existing condition is a mast cell disease, and it kind of overlaps with COVID a lot. So a lot of the treatments for my pre-existing condition overlap with COVID. And so I read a lot of patient accounts online, and I learn more from them than from any doctors. I went to an immunologist, and I said, I've had a fever over 100 most days for the last 4 months. And they were just like, yeah, we can't help you. And they were like, you could see this endocrinologist, you could see this doctor, you could see this doctor. And I was like, I've done this for 10 years in my pre-existing condition. I'm not going to be bounced around 100 specialties. But this is what I'm seeing in my patient communities, is that the doctors are just completely lost. This is an immunologist who doesn't know how to treat 5 months of a fever over 100. So I have learned from other patients that rest is incredibly important, and I am fortunate that I don't have to be at work or tend to children, and that is how I've made this second round of recovery, and I'm doing pretty good now. But I just really feel bad because I know that how I have recovered is just not systemically possible for most people that contract COVID. Nobody's getting paid to stay home and rest. And even my housing situation, that, it shouldn't have been that way for me or for the others out in the world. I should have been taken care of, So it's been a while. It's been a ride. I feel like I've been extremely well prepared for it because I was chronically ill for 10 years. So a lot of us I'm not emotionally thrown by any of this, and I'm not traumatized by suddenly being disabled. But that is the majority of what I'm seeing from other patients. I hope that helps. I don't mean to go on.
It's okay, Justine, because that is a point that I want us to circle back to about the millions of people, for all intents and purposes, regardless if you survive COVID, you could become disabled by this virus in the recovery, and nobody knows how long that's going to last. Jen, I wanted to give you an opportunity to share your experience as a chronically disabled person, as a woman of color. How has this pandemic been for you, and how is the specter of COVID sort of loomed in how you have been dealing with everyday life?
Oh, wow. Some of the things about, COVID and the pandemic and things didn't change my life too much. Like, I work from home, and with the exception of traveling, which I'm obviously not doing that right now, I'm typically at home. I have a home health aide. If she's not with me, then I'm usually here with my cat. So I'm pretty good being on my own. I'm a single child, grew up in rural areas. So being alone is okay for me. So thankfully that hasn't changed much. Even if businesses were open, because of a lot of my health problems and just disability access, I don't go out and, do the things I used to do when I was younger, like going out for dinner or for drinks with friends and such. So that I don't like that I have lost the option to do those things in some ways, but in terms of daily life, that sort of stuff hasn't impacted me personally. Where I have ran into a lot of problems is as a person with multiple chronic illnesses and disabilities, it's been difficult to get medical care. So I live in Washington, D.C., which is occupied Piscataway land. And so for a few months, the hospital that I go to for some of my care, their pain management clinic was closed. Well, I have really bad chronic pain from a variety of health problems. So if there's any doctor I have to have regular access to, it's my pain management doctor. Even under her treatment, as much as she's able to help, I still have a lot of horrible pain, and I'm just exhausted all of the time. So having to go without that care for a while really set me back quite a bit. There's some possible new health diagnoses on in the horizon for me, and some of those treatments include, what is it? Hydrocloxip. It was the drug that Trump was trying to say could keep you from getting COVID. Yes, thank you. What if I end up needing that, but then there's a shortage of it? There have been some medications that I take on a daily basis that have been put on back order. Thankfully, I've been able to get them, or I just had some extras, so I've been okay. But, what about for other people who aren't in that situation? What if you're someone that lives in a rural area and there's only one pharmacy available, and that could be 20, 30 plus miles away? What if they're out of stock of the medications you need? What if the medical care that you require is already so scarce, and now it's even more scarce because of COVID-19? So those are issues. And then something else that's been a particular issue in Washington, D.C. area, at least, and I imagine elsewhere, there is an extreme, just dire shortage of home health aides. So people who are disabled or chronically ill, or who are seniors, you have to go through a process, but you can get home health aides. They help you, with it's called activities of daily living. So, cleaning your apartment, helping with food, running errands, things like that. Thankfully, I've been able to maintain my aid services, but a lot of people, they don't have aides now. And that's, for some folks, depending on their disabilities or illnesses, that could literally mean the difference between life and death. But, here we are in DC, and we're going without these services, and the DC government is doing nothing about it, and the federal government is doing nothing about it. I could go on and on about the problems that are going on. I mean, paratransit, just as an Indigenous person, I also feel this as a disabled person. Pre-COVID, our communities were already so resource scarce because of all of the forms of institutional oppression. So when we get thrown into an emergency situation, it's that much harder for us to come back. So, transportation, what do you do if you're someone that needs public transportation because you're unable to drive? What if you need paratransit, because you're in a scooter or a wheelchair or something? A lot of those services have been cut, So even if you can get a doctor's appointment, even if your prescriptions are available, how do you get to them? It's just...
And, there does not seem to be a lot of answers forthcoming as pertaining to some of the specific things that you referenced there, Jen, from the new incoming administration, President-elect Joe Biden, VP-elect Kamala Harris. And in their COVID plan, they do talk about mask mandates, and they do address the issue of testing, free testing available for everyone. But they don't necessarily address the issues of cost of treatment, and what to do if you suddenly become disabled by COVID. Justine, I wanted to kick it back to you because what are some of the things that the federal government, and I know we could probably be here for a long time listing all of the things that the federal government and state governments, for that matter, have either missed or done wrong or done inefficiently when it comes to responding to the pandemic. But when it relates to issues specific to the disabled community, as Jen mentioned, issues of transportation, you mentioned housing, also talking about, making sure that people have access to their medications, but then people have to physically leave their house in order to go check and see about these medicines. From what the Biden people have put forth that you're aware of, and from what the Trump response has been, where are some of the big gaps in services, in care, that is being overlooked specific to the disabled community?
Well, this is not answering that directly, but the first thing is that we didn't really lock down. And so this affects everybody, especially the disabled community. We know it works to lock down from other countries, and we never really gave it a full shot. And so Biden does not seem to be wanting to go backwards economically. And so when you say what was missing from the federal or state side in terms of the disability community, it would have been preventing this pandemic from hitting us by locking down the economy and paying pandemic payments so people could stay home, which was very successful in Canada, for one. In terms of the rest of what you're talking about, the thing is that the pre-existing disabled community have been an afterthought in all of this. And so in a way, we are lucky that some attention is being put towards research. For instance, the long-term effects of a virus. There are millions of people who have been saying for decades that they caught Lyme disease, it wasn't treated in time, and they are now disabled. And the response from the medical community has been anywhere from maybe, I'm not sure I believe you, to you sound psychologically disturbed. And now COVID is proving to have long-term results on so many hundreds of thousands of people that this other community now, so there may be some advantages to what's happening with COVID that will affect the rest of the disabled community in terms of like chronic fatigue syndrome, which is something that I never really experienced, didn't understand, and now I understand what it is to not be able to stop sleeping all day. So I think the gaps that we're talking about for me are not listen, the disabled community is always going to have a lot of transportation, food, housing, financial needs. We get up to maybe $1,200 a month. We're not allowed to make more. And tell me how I'm supposed to live on that. Like, I can't. I need other help. So that whole question of where has the federal government failed the disabled community goes back decades, and under COVID isn't really that different. I think that the federal entire response to COVID just affects us more. So for me, my answer is not really an answer to your direct question. It's that they didn't prevent COVID. And they're going to be placing newly disabled COVID patients high on a hierarchy of needs. And I could see it happening under Biden, where if you had a pre-existing condition, I think this kind of neoliberal Biden mentality in some ways is going to help, and in some ways is going to hurt, because I do believe they're going to start instituting pretty strict hierarchies of whose life gets saved, who gets the needed medication. And I think we're going to be at the bottom of that. So I'm sorry if I didn't answer what you said directly, but this is where my mind went,
And that's fair, and that's okay, because I think Jen could come around and back clean up for us when it comes to this question. Dwayne, if you could you pop up A1 for us? Because when we're talking about what the governmental response is going to be, we've just elected a new president, and Joe Biden is in his putting together his cabinet. So this is an article in The Atlantic by, his name is Ezekiel Emanuel. You might recognize that horrible face because he's related to Rahm Emanuel, who's also a horrible person, in my opinion. Let me put that out there. Don't sue the Real News. Kim Brown said it out her mouth. Okay, and so he wrote this piece for The Atlantic about why it's not necessarily a good idea to live to be old or to be old and infirmed. And he is, for dying when it's convenient and at, I guess, a less of a cost to society as a whole. Can you pop up them tweets, Dwayne, please, that I referenced? T1, starting with T1. So Joe Biden possibly picking this person to be part of his coronavirus task force that's not it, but that's a good information to know. In Michigan, the past 26 days, Michigan has seen a 215% increase in hospitalization, a 146% increase in patients on ventilators, and a 137% increase in patients in the ICU. That is from WXYZ in Detroit. Ominous numbers there coming from the state of Michigan, but Michigan is not alone. I'm looking for T2, T3, and T4, because for Ezekiel Emanuel, who's Rahm Emanuel's brother, who argued in that 2019 essay that his life should end at 75, because after that age, you're no longer productive, which sounds horrifying, especially as we mourn the passing of Alex Trebek, who just died at age 80, but that is a different topic, or related topic. But anyway, a wonderful disabled activist here, her Twitter handle is For Will Workout. She talks about 1 step forward, 2 steps back. When we said Crip Vote, we weren't just shouting a slogan. We were demanding inclusion and accountability. Somebody wasn't listening. And that by that somebody, she means Joe Biden. Next tweet, please. Excerpts from the essay that go on to quote Ezekiel Emanuel's essay that he wrote for The Atlantic. The next tweet, please. And For Will Workout goes on to say, so more ableism in the White House. And since it's coming from this White House, meaning the democratically controlled White House, quote unquote, allies will embrace it. The fight is never over. Jen Derenwater, let me get your reaction to Ezekiel Emanuel being named as perhaps part of Joe Biden's coronavirus task force, and the concerns that disabled activists rightly have about not only his appointment, but what that message says to this community as a whole, who, by the way, took personal risk to make sure that Joe Biden captured the White House. What are your thoughts here?
I think it's perfectly in line with Biden and who he is and who he has shown us that he is over his decades in political office. I think it's also just telling of the larger system of politics in America. Before I started working in journalism, I worked on a lot of political campaigns, and that is one of the most ableist work environments I've ever been in. You're expected to work 80, 100-hour weeks, often without any benefits. You're a contractor, so when the job ends, you have no unemployment, no nothing. Even if you have health insurance, you're never going to have time to go to the doctor. You don't even have time to do the most basic things like sit down and eat a meal. The political world is inherently ableist. So it just genuinely doesn't matter who's in office. This is still going to be a system of ableism. I think Biden, though, is particularly troublesome, especially with this Ezekiel Emanuel, because Biden he's not a liberal. He's not radical left. He's not a moderate. Really, he's more of a conservative Democrat. He's very pro-capitalism. He is not going to quarantine. He's not going to do what we need to control the COVID-19 cases. And capitalism also really ties to eugenics. Ezekiel Emanuel's idea that after the age of 75, you're no longer productive. Well, that's saying if you're not able to keep the capitalist system going, then we have no use for you. So off you go, die quietly in a corner. That is very much in line with the way disabled people are treated in the U.S. We're treated as if we are unable of giving back to the community or the world or having a life worth living. And a lot of that is tied to our productivity and whether or not we're able to keep that system of capitalism going through our labor. And it's these sort of, well, you're no longer productive, so we're going to kill you sort of ideas of Ezekiel Emanuel. But it also really goes in line with how disabled people have been treated for so long in terms of being institutionalized. We had the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act this summer. And while the ADA doesn't go anywhere near as far to giving the protections that disabled people need, But before that, really the way disabled people were treated in the world was, well, we're going to institutionalize you. The schools, the hospitals, the stores, they're not accessible for you in your wheelchair or on your crutches or such. So we're just going to put you in an institution. And that is how the United States has treated disabled people for a very long time. And it still does. The nursing home industry is a powerful lobbying force. And there is still a constant push to put disabled people in nursing homes instead of, helping us get disability accessible housing or, personal care attendants or home health aides. So for me, this is just what I expected from Biden. I think that disabled people also need to really be worried about Biden for two other big points. One, Biden-Harris, pro-cop. Harris is a cop. We've already seen Biden-Harris are all about beating on and killing and locking up BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Disabled people are much more likely to be killed by the police than the able-bodied. And I believe it's half of those cases are actually people with mental health issues. So we're going to have people whose disabilities or illnesses are made worse by the police, or people who have disabilities and illnesses as a result of policing, as a result of the prison industrial complex. The other point that I think is really important that is made is Biden is pro-fracking. And, we're in such a dire state with global climate chaos right now, and we're seeing it. We've had, I believe, 12 hurricanes make landfall. We had the world's largest typhoon hit the Philippines. We've got constant fires everywhere, droughts. People are now becoming climate refugees. We can't have people in power who think fracking is something that should still occur. We're seeing all of these storms and flooding and fires leaving people without their homes. Well, here we are in the middle of a pandemic. How do you quarantine people? How do you keep them safe if you have so many people that are houseless now as a result of this global climate chaos created environmental impact? What do you do in that situation? I don't think Biden and Harris are going to be good for the disability community. They're not.
And thank you very much for referencing. Oh, I'm sorry, Justine. Let me just hop in here real quick, and then I'll let you hop in here. I appreciate Jen mentioning the climate change aspect of how it impacts disabled people over the summer. And I think 2 summers ago, when those wildfires were just devastating and out of control across the state of California, disabled people were complaining very loudly that with rolling blackouts instituted by the power company, PG&E, I believe, where was the contingency plans for people who were either on ventilators or who had to have equipment that was requiring electricity? Very little considerations, if any considerations, were given to the disabled populations who were living in that area, also having to fend off fires and then having to deal with the double whammy of just being forgotten about by government and the utilities. But Justine, by all means, hop in here, please.
Well, no, I'm glad you said that. I'm in California and I've been in the middle of these fires. I've never, my illness is an environmental illness. So I get sick from the toxicity in the air and in the buildings. And I've never experienced anything like this before. It was gas lines. And when you talk about PPE, some of these fires are being caused by their recklessness and their poor planning. But what I wanted to say about Emmanuel is, the idea that disabled people are sort of not valuable. I would like to be part of disarming people. When AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, talks about disarming people with racism, disability cuts so deep for able-bodied people because they know that it can happen to them. And so the prejudice is very, very high. And they believe that the steps that they're taking in their life, and I may have had this belief myself at one point, that the food that they eat and the activity that they do is preventing their disability, and it's just not a fact. It can happen to anyone, anytime. And so it's incredibly deeply emotional. And so a lot of those able belief systems are built around fear and anxiety of death and weakness. And what I would love to be able for us to be doing more, and it's going to take political leadership, is to introduce the idea of how much value disabled people add, not as inspiration porn, like, oh, that sad girl got on a wheelchair and went into the woods and had freedom. That's not healthy, for one, but that's not
Hold on. Justine, I want you to talk about that, because a lot of people are not familiar with that whole concept, and at least the impact that it has on the disabled community. So, for example, I was watching the Today Show this morning, and they had a whole segment about this young man who had Down syndrome, but he completed an Ironman triathlon. You know, he swam, biked, and what's the other? Oh, ran a marathon. And apparently he was the first young man with Down syndrome in order to do that. And we see these kinds of stories a lot, especially coming from the mainstream media.
Right.
Why are these stories harmful, more harm than good in some cases?
Well, because they're saying we cheer you on if you can look more like what we do. If you can achieve what we do, then we will applaud you. But if it is an enormous effort to get out of bed one day and feed yourself, then you are an embarrassment. Basically, that's how people look at disabled people. I was healthy and climbed mountains, and nobody should cheer me for that. But there have been days where it's been a victory for me to do the basics. And there's no applause for that and recognition for that. So it's not helpful, because most of us can't look like that or do that. And also, what I wanted to say was, our value exists outside of your ideas of value. Like, we're not valuable because we run a marathon or show up for work every day. Disabled people are incredibly important right now. Alice Wong, who's a disabled activist, called us the oracles of our time. And I know this because as a survivor of COVID, I am constantly, with a pre-existing medical condition, I am constantly advocating for newly diagnosed people in terms of offering advice about how to navigate medical systems. We have so much more to give besides what we call inspiration porn, like the Down syndrome person who ran a marathon. But it takes reorienting all of our ideas of what is value.
Jen, I'd like for you to weigh in on inspiration porn. I think it's something that it's known within the disabled community, but a lot of people will be like, why is that a bad thing? Why is it something that we shouldn't celebrate? Shouldn't we celebrate people who are disabled being able to achieve certain things? And the answer is not really.
I mean, yeah, celebrate disabled people when we do things, but kind of like Justine said, like, our value goes beyond, can we, compete in a triathlon or, run a Fortune 500 company or such. Like, our value, in general, I think society needs to stop putting value on people and things based on economic worth in that system of capitalism. But disabled people have so much more to give than what we're ever seen for. And the reason for that is that we're not really seen as people. We're not seen as adults. We're treated like children. We really are in a lot of ways. And I think that's where the inspiration porn part comes in, is that we're not seen as adults. We're not seen as human beings. We're seen as either the children that are the pain in the ass and you want them gone, or the cute little things that, oh, aren't you sweet? And you kind of pat them on the head and go about your day. It's just this idea that our lives as deaf or disabled people or chronically ill people are just so worthless that, oh, look, this poor little wretched soul just achieved, X thing. So, wow, that makes me feel better about my life.
Right.
And I've had some people, able-bodied people, say things like that to me, like, oh God, I don't know how you do it with all your health problems. Like, it makes me feel better about myself. And it's like, I'm not here to make you feel better about yourself because you think my life is such shit, and if you think that my life is more difficult than it should be, how about you stop being ableist and fight for disability justice? If you think our lives are so awful then why don't you fight for us to have the things that we need, that we demand, that we've been out here demanding for a very long time? I also want to add that disabled people, we are one of the groups of people that have been fighting to keep the ACA in place. We're a lot of the people that are going into the Capitol building and getting dragged out of senators and representatives' offices because we know the ACA must stay in place or be given a better option, because let's be real, the ACA is still not what the country really needs. But we're the ones doing that, and I feel like as a disabled person, I'm just seen as being worthless. It's also how I feel as a Native person. While I am not a Biden-Harris fan, 97% of people from the Navajo Nation, they voted for Biden and Harris. Here is a group of people that CNN referred to us as something else when they were talking about the racial breakdown of voting in the presidential election. And here Navajo Nation is also one of the hardest hit communities under the COVID-19 pandemic, and yet 97% of them voted for Biden. We have worth. Disabled people have worth. Native folks, Black, brown people, we have worth. And we have to stop thinking about disabled people's lives as just being expendable.
Absolutely. I wanted us to sort of, you guys hit on so many points. I'm not even sure where to go back to because, we're talking about, how disabled people are seen and treated by society at large. But then there are a large portions of the disabled community whose disabilities are not obvious. They're not visible. Invisible disability or disability invisibility, as it were. And I'm struck by the name of Walter Wallace Jr., the young man who was shot and killed by Philadelphia police in front of his home. He was allegedly having a mental health episode. My heart breaks for his family. And at the same time, my heart breaks for him because his family called the police to their home to deal with him. And that is something that happens far too often. The police are not mental health experts. They are not equipped to deal with someone who is having a mental health crisis. We've seen this so many times where people who are dealing with mental health issues are murdered by the police, confronted by the police, sometimes even drugged by the police to tragic effects. Justine, when we talk about Black Lives Matter and defund the police, that is absolutely an issue that pertains to communities of color, but it absolutely overlaps with the disability community as well, because they are the victims overwhelmingly of police violence due to ignorance by the police. And tragically, for some of these families who are dealing with this, they feel as though the police is their last option, when so many times the police are the ones that end up taking their loved ones' lives. What is your response?
Yeah, we don't really talk about how many of these prominent cases of people being killed by police were disabled people. Freddie Gray was disabled. He had lead paint poisoning, and he was also asthmatic. So when you look at the conditions that led to him finally being killed by police, he was screaming loudly in police custody. And the thing about being disabled is that you do experience pain differently. And people with cognitive, which he had, or emotional differences express pain differently. Sandra Bland, she, I believe, had seizures, correct? And she said it to one of the cops. And he said, "Good," if I have that right. And so, the other thing about being a disabled person navigating the world is that authority means something different to you. Closeness to your body means something different to you. I have had seizures and had police called on me. I have experienced all of this personally. It's terrible. They are really bad. They don't know what to do. Because if we look at what it is that policing represents in our society, and not just policing, also mental health, When we talk about if we just replace the police with social workers, that is probably some level, yes, that is harm reduction. Social workers don't carry guns. But I don't think it's as much harm reduction as people think. I think we're going to see, if you've experienced social workers or hospitalization, you have experienced incarceration. If you've had a 72-hour hold. So it's sort of looking at what role police play in our society and other institutions to regulate difference. And that when you are disabled, and especially if it intersects with either Black or brownness or with being a woman, then your disability gets magnified and experienced differently. And you also respond differently to the world. The police are always constantly killing and shooting autistic people. I have Asperger's. We don't express ourselves in situations like everybody else, which is what makes us so amazing. But police don't know how to respond to that. So this is really sort of at the core of how these institutions function to regulate social difference.
Mm-hmm. Jen, you sounded like you wanted to hop in there and weigh in on that. By all means, honey, go ahead.
Kind of going off of what Justine said, that I think is also really important about the police, which I think need to be done away with, period. No police at all. But we have to think about the way that they're trained. So I'm just, this whole idea that, oh, not all cops are bad. Well, let's say you do have one cop, decent human being, but has been trained to give commands and to interact with people with the idea that they can hear, they can see, they have full range of motion and movement, that they're cognitively and emotionally able to process information. That's how they're trained to interact with people. I don't do as much as I would like just because of my disabilities, but I sometimes do some frontline news coverage. And I'm always afraid that I'm going to have some line of law enforcement, telling me to get on the ground or something. I cannot get down on my knees. Like, I physically can't do that, even on the best day for me, I can't do that. I have really bad asthma. If they hit me directly with mace, even just breathing like mace and tear gas in, I start having asthma attacks. If it's bad enough, I could die from that, everything the police have been taught to do. It's not about helping people or the betterment of communities. It's about keeping systems of capitalism and colonialism and whatnot in place, which means dehumanizing people. And so even if you think there are some good individual cops, they're still not even trained on how to work with really the average person, whether that person considers themselves deaf or disabled or ill,
Jen, that is so valid. And I'm going to share the story very quickly before we move on. But anyway, so I moved to a new place several years ago, a place I was unfamiliar with. One night, I thought I heard someone trying to break in the house. I called 911. Police showed up at my house, scared the fucking shit out of me. Okay. I came to the door. I walked out on the porch. It's 5 cops with guns pointing in my direction. And they're all screaming different commands to me. Come outside, put your hands up. I'm like, Jesus, I called y'all. First mistake, which I will never do again. I will never call the police to my house. But one of my takeaways from that experience was, what if I was having a mental health episode? What if I was deaf or hard of hearing and was not able to hear or interpret their commands? I had a cell phone in my hand. I was still on the phone with 911. If for whatever reason, what if I was inebriated? What if I was under the influence? What if I was just belligerent that night? Like, I could have easily lost my life because the police were making assumptions that I was able-bodied, able to hear, able to cognitively follow what they were telling me. And I just realized that a lot of assumptions are being made. And this is how a lot of people end up losing their lives, because police are not really trained to deal with people which you think they would be considering they are public safety officers. But I just wanted to share that story. And thank you so much for raising that point, Jen. Dwayne, I want us to go to the video that I referenced in the Slack, because another issue that has been raised during the pandemic as it directly impacts the disabled community, and possibly Jen and Justine, you guys can share with us, how this was probably an issue before the pandemic, but the issue of rationing of care. And as we're seeing infection spike, hospitalization spike, people who have to be intubated spike, we're seeing a lot of these medical resources be sort of petered out piecemeal or as available. In some places, these resources are way more available than they are in others. And CBS News did an interesting package. I think this was just a couple of weeks ago. So Dwayne, if we could check out that package about how care is being rationed in this pandemic and how it could infect disabled people first and foremostly.
The situation in Utah's hospitals is increasingly dire. Experts are warning that doctors may soon need to confront the unthinkable: rationing healthcare as beds fill up and staff are stretched thin. Dr. Eddie Stinium is an infectious disease physician there.
At this point, there's really no end in sight for us. Our case counts are continuing to rise. Our hospitalizations are continuing to rise. So there's no rounding the curve for us here in Utah.
The possibility of having to ration care is also becoming a concern in parts of Idaho, where COVID hospitalizations have more than doubled since the beginning of October. At St. Luke's Magic Valley, Dr. Joshua Kern says roughly 30% of the hospital's 150 patients are infected with coronavirus.
It's totally unprecedented. Even during bad influenza seasons, it's not like we see, a third of the patients in the hospital with influenza. It's teetering on the brink, right? We're right there. We need to turn things around or we're going to be in big trouble.
To Wisconsin now. Dr. Jeff Potoff at University Hospital in Madison says 4 of his hospital's COVID wings are full. So they're opening another converted wing this week.
It's never been worse for us here in Wisconsin, and every day it's not getting better. It's getting a little bit worse. The ice is so thin right now as we try to do everything we can, get as creative as we can to take care of all the patients that need our services.
All 3 of these doctors agree there is no end in sight for the pandemic.
Okay.
For CBS This Morning, I'm David Begnaud in New York.
Earlier in the pandemic, we focused on a story, I believe, that was initially reported by the Texas Tribune, where a man who had contracted COVID was receiving intensive care and was in the hospital. And his wife decided to run video on her encounters with the doctors, who were trying to insist to her that he be taken off of life support or taking off the ventilator because he was a quadruple amputee. But this person was also a family man. He was a husband. He was a father. And not saying that because he held those titles also that made his life more valuable. But the wife was trying to impress to the medical staff that, hey, because my husband is disabled does not mean that his life does not have value and does not mean that he is not able to fight and possibly recover from COVID. So this eugenics portion of the program that COVID is sort of highlighted within the American healthcare system is as scary as fuck. I can't remember who I need to lead off with because you both are coming with the heat and with the flame. Jen, I'm gonna go to you because why are these questions being raised in general? I mean, there's this. People seem to think that America in the 20th and 21st century is probably the best place for disabled people to be because of the resources we have available. I know it's funny, right? I mean, it is funny, right? But I mean, people would be like, decades ago, we would do what you mentioned earlier was institutionalize people, and now people can stay home and they can integrate their lives in a lot of normal ways. But still, when it comes to whose life matters the least, disabled people are usually pushed towards the front. How is rationing of care during this pandemic really illuminating that grotesque sort of practice?
I mean, it's once again just deciding whose lives had value. It's a continuation of eugenics and genocide. We see this across marginalized and oppressed communities. Indigenous, Black and brown folks much less likely to be taken seriously when we go to an emergency room. I can say that I, as a disabled Native woman with chronic pain, I'm either told that the pain is all in my head and I'm crazy, or I'm treated like I'm a drug addict and I'm just trying to get drugs from them. And it's constant. It's constant. I even just had a recent experience with a rheumatologist that had MRI reports right in front of her saying that I most likely have a particular illness. And she still sat there and said that some of my pain is due to mental illness.
Ooh, Jesus.
So we've already decided whose lives do and don't matter. And so, of course, you're going to see that heightened in a pandemic. It was just last night, it was announced that there are no ICU beds in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Most of my childhood was spent in Tulsa County. Oklahoma is a fairly rural state. We only have two large cities. It's Tulsa and Oklahoma City. So if you have no ICU beds in Tulsa and somebody's sick, they're injured, something's happened, even if it's not COVID related, what happens? Who gets care? Whose life do you decide matters enough to give care to? When there's a shortage of medical staff, there's a shortage of PPE and ventilators and, physical space and all the things that's needed, you're going to see medical staff making really horrific decisions that are often going to be based in genocidal and eugenic, thoughts around eugenics. Like, that's what you're going to see.
Justine, what are your thoughts about the issue of rationing care? I mean, I know it's bad, right? it's a bad thing,
Yeah.
But how it's being put into practice with the pandemic spiking yet again, hospital beds, the availability of those ever shrinking, and yet, disabled people. And then, as Jen mentioned, like, how does the sexism and the racism also compound onto the ableism? You know what I mean? Like, the three of us are unmarried, childless folks. Like, I can totally see a doctor be like, oh, well, they don't have a partner, or, they're not a mom. Fuck them. Yeah. Let's send them out to dry.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts here, Justine?
Well, doctors are really, I have a lot of years of experience, and my mother was ill too. Doctors really have some of the worst bias of any profession, and that has to do with their, with science training in our culture, the medical training, and then just sort of the privilege handed to them, and then the fact that they're around people in distress all the time. And so, most people who've had an elderly parent have stories about the doctor saying, maybe you should pack it in now. A doctor told my mom that 10 years before she died. There was no reason she had to go into convalescence. She had cancer and wasn't dying, and most of her organs were working, and she was walking around. So it was really bizarre. And I've heard it too, being relatively young, and you'll probably never walk again, be cool with it. And that's just their thinking. And so we have to match that with policy. And if there's rationing of care that has to happen, it has to happen. We have that already with donor lists, but what we need are disabled people, who are involved in creating the policies to decide how care gets rationed, and to make sure that doctor bias is not included in that at all. Ideally with donor lists, it's first come, first serve. If somebody is really near the end of their life and that is somehow measurable, then that's a different story. But for the most part, we need to find ways to ration care. Well, first of all, lock down the damn country. Let's stop the pandemic. And then get more care, get more beds. But then if you do have to ration it, it needs to be done in a way that is without ableism, sexism, racism, etc.
Mm-hmm. Guys, I want to read the comments real quick, and then I'm going to hit you with one last topic. Get your reaction, and then we're going to say goodnight. Shades. Hi, Elena. Shade says, living in a capitalist society makes ableism even worse. If you're not, quote, productive, you're worthless, as if we don't inherently have value for just existing. Elena, you are the most valuable player in your whole family. I love you so much. Red Sea Socialist says the federal government doesn't care about the vulnerable communities because it's not profitable. Yeah, y'all. I mean, again, when you think about I mean, all this, the way that disabled people, elderly people are treated in the 20th, 21st century, 19th century. I mean, this is all recent shit. Like, of course, in human history, we were kind of better to each other. Johnny J, you know we love Johnny J. Johnny J says, and Native communities have lost so many to the virus. The actions taken are not overreactions. They are not enough. Thank you so much for watching, Johnny J. Lastly, Justine N. Jen. There is allegedly a vaccine on the horizon. Pfizer has released news that their vaccine trial is apparently going swimmingly. They expect that this vaccine that they have promised perhaps could offer as much as 90% effectiveness protection against coronavirus. I was talking to Justine earlier and I said, "Oh, Justine, isn't that great? They have a vaccine for the coronavirus." And she goes, "Well, which strain?" And I go, "I don't know which strain." which strain? Most people are hearing the news about a vaccine potentially offering some promise here and perhaps being available within the coming weeks, but it's not necessarily great news because there's a lot we still don't know. Justine, what are your concerns?
My concern is with a culture obsessed with cures and magic bullets, and these kind of I don't know if there's going to be a virus that cures us. I am dubious. We also have profit incentive. Every illness that I have, there's some promised cure all the time that turns out to cause as many problems for me as it does, help me. So I think it would be great if we could COVID is an opportunity to remake society around accepting disability and illness and accommodating around it, while also working towards cures. But my fear right now is that everything's going to be put into vaccine emotionally and politically, and we're going to miss what we should be doing otherwise. And then the vaccine, like all flu and other virus vaccines, is not at first as successful as people would have hoped.
Well said, Justine. I agree. I think a lot of expectation is being put into this vaccine when the government could, pay people to stay home and sit their ass inside for 6 weeks. Jen Deerenwater, the thought of a coronavirus vaccine, is it as exciting as it's being sold to us as it is? Or what are the potential drawbacks for a vaccine and even how it will be distributed?
I have numerous concerns about the vaccine. I mean, normally it takes years of research and testing to create a vaccine. So something happening overnight like this, I don't trust it. But even drug trials and such, I'm also skeptical, because who are the people that the drugs are being tested on? Who are they looking at? Are they treating people that don't have pre-existing conditions? Are they treating men? Are they treating women? Are they treating people of color? Who is it that they're taking into account when they're creating medications and vaccines and such? Are you thinking about the societal and environmental factors that can also play a role in someone's health? I just am very skeptical in general of some of these things. I'm not an anti-vaxxer though, so please don't think that I am. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm just very skeptical of this particular vaccine. And also, as it was said, like, viruses mutate. COVID-19 has already mutated. Even if we have a vaccine, it's, I don't feel like it's going to necessarily protect everyone. As we know with some vaccines, not everyone can get the vaccines. I some time back did the Hep A and Hep B vaccines, and I had to do the Hep B vaccine a second time because my body didn't take the antibodies the first time. Not everyone can get vaccines, and I have a lot of concerns with it. And then even if it is, we'll say the best vaccine possible, who gets to access it? Is it going to be mostly for the wealthy? And if we say, oh, insurance will pay for it, well, does that also include Medicare? Does that include Medicaid? Does that include the Indian Health Services and the urban Indian Health Services that are under IHS? I'm skeptical.
Justifiably so. 100%. Every person who has paid attention to this government, and of course, if you come from a marginalized community, you better have a healthy dose of skepticism when dealing with the U.S. government. We know who should get it first. Frontline communities, of course, Native people, Black people, people who have been disproportionately dying from COVID-19 should absolutely be first in line. But we know, medical professionals are supposed to be front in line to get it. Also, people in nursing homes. So let's hope that they are mitting this out like in a smart, effective way. But chances are it's probably going to be who has privilege and who has access will most likely get it first. But Jen, I'm like you. I'm not an anti-vaxxer either. I ain't getting that first coronavirus shot though. Nope. Y'all, when they do COVID vaccine 2.0, I'll be right there, but not for the first one. We got to see who grows a tail and other random things that could totally happen. But that is our time. I want to thank you both for such a fantastic and dynamic conversation. I want to preemptively invite you both back because I want us to have another conversation about the ways to dismantle the fucked up healthcare system in our country. And, with such reticence about socialized medicine and this, that, and the third, I really feel as though Americans don't know what we're missing. And not to say that the European countries have it right, but they do it way, way better. And the Asian countries as well. So I want us to have a conversation about, Western medicine, the American healthcare system, and how disabled people can be, elevated to the top instead of relegated to the bottom. So thank you so much to Jen Derenwater and Justine Baron. I really like you both a lot. I appreciate your conversations, your perspectives. You guys are super smart, super funny, and you're always welcome on Burn It Down with Kim Brown. Thank you both. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
You guys rock. Hey, listen, if you're watching us on the Real News Network YouTube channel, thanks. But head over to Burn It Down with Kim Brown. We have our own YouTube channel, trying to get our subscribers up so we can do some funky stuff on the YouTube channel. But we need people to go over there and like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for hanging out with us in the chat and in the comments. And we will resume again on Friday, where perhaps President Trump will be successful in his coup to remain in the White House and disregard the results of the election. We are witnessing an attempted coup in the United States. So that'll be a big conversation for us on Friday. Thank you so much for checking out Burn It Down with Kim Brown. See y'all later. Bye-bye.